Life's Learning Curve, episode 44.
Good day, everybody, and welcome back to Life's Learning Curve, the podcast. I'm former educator and current media producer Paul Hart, your host. Our podcast is about finding the best us, getting better, and trying to do that through reflection and storytelling so we can be better for not only ourselves, but be better for the people that surround us, our families and friends and strangers even. So today's show began for me, quite honestly, when I was trying to fall asleep just a couple nights ago. I wasn't thinking, what's a good podcast to do? I was trying to fall asleep and my brain kept taking me back exactly to my neighborhood. The place where I grew up, back around ages, I lived in that one house from ages 1 through 21, if you pull out college. These persistent images of people, houses, not my friends, but just like the environment that I lived in, they were suddenly really clear again and very vivid. Super clear in my mind. Why? I wondered. As I laid there and thought about this really comfortable and nurturing feeling of love overtook me. It was warm, it was safe. Now I'm more awake than asleep, and my inner voice told me that falling asleep and dreaming of this was not going to be an option. So I got up, went to my office, and I wrote a quick outline for this podcast episode. Very clear, very vivid in my head at the time. It was as if I was being told something. It was as if my inner voice was saying I needed to revisit my old neighborhood. To be honest with you, this has not happened to me before. My neighborhood was there, just like it was. It was waiting for me to come back and visit.
Time to go.
Life's Learning Curve. I'm Paul Hart. Episode Invited Back Home. Stand by. There are things in life we hold on to about our childhood because they were so much a part of our life, but you don't recognize your environment around you as you're a young person. There's places you went, places your parents took you, the backyard, the front yard, the driveway, the neighbors you knew. When I was growing up, life was more simple, right? It's true for almost all of us. At least that's what I remember. Hey, remember the age when you were so young that you were not allowed to leave the driveway? Pretty young, right? Then soon, after a month or so, you could exit the driveway but use the sidewalks in front of the house. Maybe with your tricycle or your bike or whatever. But only on your side of the street. You couldn't cross that street. And as years passed, soon that sidewalk couldn't hold you anymore. As a young person, we all felt the neighborhood calling to us around the bend. What's up there? What's around the corner? Even though you traveled it in a car, you didn't really pay attention. Well, at least I didn't. We began to get our wanderlust at an early age. Curiosity. Outgrowing what we were used to. Now, this episode is about those years, the ones where we were confined, restrained to the driveway, the nearby sidewalk. We were outside, it was warm, it was summer-like, and perennially safe at home. Morning music. First, let me say, unknowingly, I exceeded the perimeters of my home block rules quite by accident. As a 3-year-old or an early 4-year-old, I don't know, I'm in between there somewhere, I used to get up at 5:30 in the morning. I did it. That was just when I woke up. I did not always awaken my parents. I learned not to. Go back to sleep for a little while. I was old enough. I should have gone back to sleep, but I didn't. I was a quiet kid, as I was told, and somehow I had learned to unlock the back door. We had this skeleton key that was easy enough for me to unlock in a counterclockwise motion. And my first step outside surrounded me with the early morning aromas of breakfast being cooked in nearby homes. Sizzly bacon, crisp sausage, eggs, fluffy golden butter-filled pancakes, and regular grind coffee, which was an American staple back then. I'd climb aboard my brown tricycle with beige streamers attached to the handlebars and pedal. Why? Well, I had heard music playing somewhere. I slowly pedaled my brown tricycle down the driveway, turned left, went to the corner, turned left again. I was already breaking rules that I didn't even know about, but I was off property. I pedaled toward the sound of the music and turned left again. I was safely onto the next street as I discovered the house of the source of the music. It was Mrs. O'Farley's house. Now, each morning, all summer, Mrs. O'Farley would rise around 5 a.m. probably and open her front door, open her back door. That was to initiate the cool early morning breeze coming through the house. Next, she would sit down at her family organ and she played. She played beautiful, rich music. Soon 4-year-old me arrived, pedaling all the way up to her porch step, right in front of her house, where I just sat and listened. Through the front porch door came beautiful, lush music. I just sat there, mesmerized by the sounds, the music, and her mastery kind of playing it. At the time, I remember most people had either an organ in their house or a piano in their house. It just seemed that way. If you walk into somebody's house when you were a kid, there was a piano or an organ somewhere in the front room. And Mrs. O'Farley had this great organ with this warm, resonant sound that she played. I don't recall seeing her ever, but apparently she saw me. Back then, every neighbor had one another's phone number, so after about 2 weeks of me leaving the house and pedaling to Mrs. O'Farley's house, Mrs. O'Farley appropriately called my mom.
Hello?
Shirley?
Yes.
Katie O'Farley here. Hey,
Katie.
did you know that your little boy, Paul, had been pedaling his bicycle over to my house every morning the past 2 weeks?
I know.
About, I don't know, early, 5:30 or 5:40. I don't mind, but I just wanted you to know where he was.
Oh, thank you so much.
I recall my mom was startled and disbelieving. My mom asked me about it, and I told her,
Sure, Mom. She plays music. It's so pretty. It's nice. Paul, how do you know where to go? I just pedal. I find the music.
after that. Our family back door key was hidden, so I couldn't get out. Fair enough. I learned to sleep in later. I did really miss Mrs. O'Farley and the music that she brought to my life at such a young age. The best neighbors ever. Our next door neighbors to the right of our house, if you're facing our house, were an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Bang. He was an industrial watch repairman at our town's pride and joy, the Elgin Watch Factory.
How about that?
The wife, Mrs. Bang, she was a homemaker and a baker and cook of tremendous talent and diversity. They both were always very kind to our family, as well as kind to my sister and me.
Hey, Cindy.
They were community people. They were Christian people and always saw the good in other people.
Hey, Paul, you doing today?
Good neighbors. You truly don't know what a good neighbor actually is until you get older and you realize that every next door neighbor is not Mr. and Mrs. Bang. Jumping ahead just a few years, I recall that when I was 16 years old and my band came over to practice quite loudly in our basement 2 to 3 times a week. It was loud, we were in the basement, but it could be heard outside our house perimeter. Mr. and Mrs. Bang never complained. I remember going next door frequently the following day after practice and apologizing for all our rock and roll noise coming from our basement. But they were full of smiles. Mr. Bang told me that when my band practiced, they would both just come outside onto their screened-in porch and listen till the 9 p.m. cutoff. Then they went to bed. I'm sorry about the noise, Mr. and Mrs. Bang. To my surprise, Mr. Bang smiled, even broader, and he said, "Hey, we just shut off the TV and we come and sit outside and kind of enjoy it.
Kind of like it, Paul.
Kind. Just amazing people.
How about that?
My other neighbor might be from Area 51. Now, to the left of our house was Mrs. Barman. She was widowed. A 50-ish older woman with shoulder-length, kind of scraggly hair, glasses, and a temperament for confrontations. She was a neighbor with quite a few eccentricities, which scared and kept my sister and me at a distance from her. Her front yard was mowed and groomed like the others in our neighborhood, but her backyard had gone wild. It was not groomed, it was not mowed, and the weeds grew very tall. So tall that the grass, the thistles, the wildflowers, which were outpouring a lot of pollen, had grown at least 5 feet tall. Because my mom and my sister had strong allergies, my dad erected a stockade fence to lessen the spread of allergic triggers, hoping it wouldn't bother Mrs. Barman. But it did. Most everything did. It became ridiculous sometimes. Mrs. Barman would frequently come to our back door to let my mom know about how loud, how discourteous, or how overtly happy my sister and I were when we played in the backyard.
It's just not right, Tilley, for children to be happy and laugh all the time. It's not good.
My mom would sit and listen.
Come on in and have some coffee.
My mom always invited Mrs. Barman to come into our house, but usually she never came in.
No.
Usually leaving soon after her complaints.
I have to go feed the cat.
To keep the peace, my mother always offered to have a talk with my sister and I in our overt happiness, to keep it under control, I guess. But my mom was very savvy regarding Mrs. Barman. She was a good listener and she kind of read between the lines. She did sit my sister and me down and talk to us and told us that Mrs. Barman was an older woman and she liked her tranquility and quiet. And if she was outside, we should try to be as quiet and as unobtrusive as possible. But late at night after we were put to bed, through the heating vents of our house, my sister and I overheard my parents sharing the truths.
She just doesn't
We were
like
just too young to understand at the time that Mrs. Barman really was kind of a sad woman. She was needy and very dependent. She liked complaining about my sister and me. This gave her purpose and reason to come over and socialize with my mom. In her own kind of depraved way, she socialized through complaining, but it got her out and around. It was hard for my sister Sue and I to understand that back then, but I do understand now. My sister Sue and I decided that in her detached, unused garage had to be a spaceship. After all, Mrs. Barman was so peculiar that she must be an alien. She had to be. She also owned 2 cats, Topsy, who frequently selected my mom to bite when she got too close, and a gentler cat, Furball. Once while playing wiffle ball in our backyard with my sister and some friends, our ball was batted over Mrs. Barman's fence, or our fence, I should say, into her yard, into the tall weeds. My sister Sue stealthily entered Mrs. Barman's wild weed garden through her wire gate full of rust.
There's weeds everywhere.
Because only my sister Sue was allowed to retrieve the wiffle ball. Sue was careful, she had told my mother. Mrs. Barman said I was too oafish to walk through her plants. Air quotes on that. We certainly had contrasting next-door neighbors. Tilley and the Johnson family. Across the street from our house, directly across, was a woman named Tilley Glissman, who was a kindly, nurturing older woman, probably in her 70s, who loved kids and always had a crinkled smile and a plate of delicious butter cookies at the ready. I always thought Tilley was a cool name for back then. It had to be a nickname. I've never heard it as a given name. A house away was another family similar to ours in age, as my parents' age, the Johnson family. They seemed to be that great American family right out of a Scott Forsman reading book in school. Every day, Mr. Johnson would exit the house exclaiming, "Hello, Robert," to my father. He walked very erect and tall, shoulders back and proud. His wife was named Helen, and she was a friendly, cooperative, good neighbor, my mom's age. And over the years, I often would come inside and see that there they were sitting at the dining room table having coffee and coffee cake or something like that, and having a nice chat. The Johnson kids, Julie and Randy, were different ages from Sue and me, almost reversed. I recall that they were really popular, and they were very bright. I have no idea why we never played together. We should have. But I have to tell you, it was always comforting to see the Johnson family for me. It was like a reflection of my own family, but it was across the street. Bloody footprints in the snow. This is truly and really my sister's story because she recalls it. I was too young to remember this at all, but based on her recollection, it was winter time. She was around 5 or 4, and she came running into the house because she'd been playing in the snow outside, and she exclaimed she had seen bloody footprints in the snow. For that untruth, Sue got sent to her room for telling that story. Finally, my parents decided, well, Sue doesn't make up a lot of stories, so they went outside and checked it out. 3 houses down from us sat a decrepit, uncared-for small home. A down-on-his-luck man named Carl had lived there, still lived there. Carl was a kind man, yet he kept to himself. Carl didn't have a car, and he didn't have money for bus fare, so he frequently walked everywhere he had to go, all the time, wearing what I remember as a tattered winter coat and shoes with skinny soles on them. Knowing my parents, I'd like to think they probably helped him out somehow, but I never remember hearing them do that. If they did usually help neighbors, it was a quiet thing. Back to the bloody footprints in the snow. After my sister's discovery, my parents both went outside, and sure enough, on the sidewalk in front of our house, there were footprints, outlined in gobs of human blood, which contrasted with the bright white snow. As they followed the footprints, they led to the door of Carl's small ramshackle home. Apparently, Carl had varicose veins, and apparently these varicose veins had burst while he was walking. And he was in great pain while he walked home, and he had oozed blood up over his socks, down his shoes, and onto the sidewalk, all the way to his house. You know, the only constant thing in life always seems to be change. It's written on posters everywhere. After that, Carl kind of disappeared. And that next summer, Carl's house was torn down, and it became an overgrown, empty lot, much like Mrs. Barman's backyard. Wild weed garden area. More on that later. The mentor.
Hi, Bob.
A gentleman named Walt lived directly behind our garage area. There was our garage, an alley, then Walt's garage and house, which led to the next block. Walt and his wife were people lovers and were definitely grandparent material. He was quietly very funny, and he made my father laugh. I liked to see that. Even if I wasn't in or didn't get what he was saying, he made my father laugh. Now, my father went through his life sourcing out people that he considered good mentors. Walt was definitely one of these people. At the back of Walt's property, he had a giant weeping willow tree with the long, droopy branches from which we could take turns trying to swing like Tarzan. And at least once or twice each day in the summer, we would swing on that tree on the branches. Walt didn't care. He just came out and sat in the sun watching us swing on the branches, and he'd watch us fall and crash, and Walt would have a chuckle. It was gentle humor. Wally, the ex-Marine. Okay, down the alley, just a few houses on the opposite side, there was a man who constantly was working in his garage. His name was Wally, and he always had 3 garage doors, 3 bays of garage doors, and they always were open. And he was fixing cars or fixing engines. When you walk by, you smell the grease, you'd smell oil, you'd smell beer, and a lot of sad country songs emitting from that garage.
Call the cops and call a priest. Man, I'm in the belly of the beast.
A welder's torch often flamed on, with nearby oil drums ready to blow at any second. Probably in his 40s, Wally never wore a shirt and was heavily tattooed. He was an ex-Marine who always seemed kind of gruff and kind of grim. You know, I always thought that Wally was a reminder of where my dad had come from back when he was a young, rebellious type kid. And somehow he and my father became friends. Dad still acted like dad around Wally. Professional, college, whatever. But definitely seemed to understand the man. That was the magic of my father, too. Throughout my dad's life, I've seen him approach the most unapproachable people, from dark and threatening motorcycle bikers to this ex-Marine Wally. And within minutes, he would have them smiling and seeing a positive light. You know, in retrospect, my dad was like an angel. Wherever he went, he seemed to make things better. Very subtly, though, he would find the friend lost inside these people, the person they actually wanted to be, but they were masking it for some reason or another. Maybe it was important for them, maybe something had happened, I don't know. It was amazing, and I saw it over and over again with my dad. As a child, I overheard distress calls come into our home, and my father was called out of the house to help with other people's domestic disputes between spouses. And many years later, when I asked him about it, how he managed those situations, he always said that he would just always show up somewhat puzzled. It was part of the process, I guess. He'd show up somewhat puzzled and distract the people, play cards with them, talk about their kids, or talk about how much the family depended on them. Quite simple, but a genius way of managing angry, violent, or sad or grieving people. He showed up as a friend, not a decider. When life seemed out of whack, my dad was able to make others see the simpleness and yet the tremendous value they had in their own lives. It was very inspiring to me. I didn't understand how he did this, or it didn't even look like he was trying, but it happened. Now, I confess I'm not the man my father was. The go-kart. Around age 11, I really wanted a mini bike. My parents were not motorcycle people. They were anti-two-wheel vehicle people and strongly pushed me toward a four-wheeled, low-to-the-ground go-kart. And apparently my father had a friend from back in his hometown, the small farming community of Elburn, who was a fireman and a champion welder as well. His boy had outgrown it, and he asked my father if he knew of anyone that might want to buy it. $35 later, I was the proud owner of an amazingly fast red go-kart. To make it my own right away, my dad suggested that I paint it a color. Blue I chose. Years and years of fun was had with that go-kart. You know, but it's funny. What I remember about the go-kart has less to do with driving it, but a lot to do with the people I shared it with and the adventures I experienced along the way. Remember bloody footprints in the snow, Carl? Well, Carl's house had been torn down, and what remained was a weed-filled empty lot. My Kite and Creek friend Jeff and I soon modified Carl's old lot using a hoe and 2 sickles. But what we really needed to make a track in that lot was a huge highway grader. And that wasn't going to happen because we couldn't modify the landscape. So instead, we used the gravel-filled alley behind our house. We had to be careful. Cars were on there. People were on there sometimes. We couldn't harass or engage with any cars or irritate any people, neighbors, or things like that. So there was a lot of rules that came with using the alley. My parents tried to be out there with us as well. My friends and I had to be careful. For fun, we pulled out of the garage these old paint horses and a checkered tablecloth, and it made the alley feel like an Indy 500 track. And we raced that go-kart up and down the alley, we clocking it using this old stopwatch my father loaned me. Mr. and Mrs. Bang happily cheered us on. Mrs. Barman scowled at us, and my family gained a new good friend down the alley. It was exmarine Wally, who took a great interest in keeping the weld solid on the go-kart. He even smiled and waved a bit as we drove by his darkened garage. Hey, Wally's responding to us. Cool. We also gained a new nemesis as well. As hard as we tried, we couldn't get Mr. Williams, a retired widowed policeman, to stop calling the police on us. Each time the police arrived, which is about 6 times as I recall, they talked firmly to us, yet kindly to us. And I felt that it was very cool of the police not to harass us, but rather tell us not to drive near Mr. Williams' house because he was greatly bothered by the go-kart.
You see, son, Mr. Williams lives all by himself. His wife is gone, and he calls us a lot about everything, so we'll just stop by. Talk about the good old days on the police force with him. But frankly, we just don't have that kind of time. So listen, Paul, you'll be doing yourself and us a favor by staying away from Mr. Williams and his property.
Yes, sir.
We agreed. Twice, we went down to knock on Mr. Williams' door to apologize to him, but he never accepted our apology. Just squinted at us, and he called us
Punks
and
young hoods.
I was pretty much a goof at that age, so Mr. Williams was missing defining us by a mile.
Waste of my time.
I always left respectfully, and he slammed the door on us. It was like a TV show. I remember there was a time when the clutch broke on my go-kart, and even though we couldn't use the go-kart for around 3 weeks, retired neighbor Mr. Williams, former policeman, continued to call the police on us, even when we weren't using the go-kart. Finally, my dad told me that he was going to go down and have a talk with Mr. Williams.
Sorry about this, Dad.
I watched my dad slowly walk down the alley toward Mr. Williams' house. My father had bettered himself throughout his life. That's a good thing. Until my father became what I would call a community helper, a leader, respected, much like Mr. Johnson across the street. Yet, with incidents like this one with Mr. Williams, the former policeman, my dad's former life as a toughened youth and his current leader version of himself contrasted. I did not know who was walking down the alley that day. What would happen? It took me a couple of days to get the courage to ask my father what he had said to Mr. Williams. What was that conversation about? Now, as old as I am, I will never forget what my dad told me because I believe this defined both versions of my father for me, for my life. The young tough versus the leader mentor.
What did you say to him, Dad?
He was brilliant.
What did you say
My
to him?
dad told me,
Well, I just told him that kids need constructive activities in a community, positive activities. If they don't get that, you'll see the community kids doing other things, bad things, like breaking windows, breaking your windows.
What did you say then, Dad?
I asked.
I just walked away.
Well, how did you know to say that might be something that would happen?
My dad just smiled at me just slightly, and he looked down and he looked at me with a smirk on his face, and he said,
I was one of those kids once. We didn't have a lot to do in Elburn. A lot of times we broke windows.
my father was my first hero, first of many to come, and he always had my back. On a cold November day, I looked out the window and I noticed my go-kart was missing. I'd always chained and locked it to an exterior plumbing pipe near the back door, which was always blocked in by one of our family cars. During the night, someone had cut the chains, and they had to lift that go-kart up and over that family car. It couldn't be driven out or pushed out. The car blocked the exit for that go-kart, so someone had to pick it up, probably 75 pounds, had to be more than one person probably. It was bulky, and they had to lift it over our parked car and carry it away. Gone. From that go-kart, I learned a lot. My father having a solid basic knowledge of engines and such, which had come from years in the service and learning about engines on the fly as a youth. My dad used what he had in his brain to rebuild, fix, make better parts, which had failed on the go-kart. The clutch, the brake, cables, basic maintenance. As he repaired, I watched until finally I noticed I was doing all the things he had taught me. To this day, when I work on a car, what I still see is my father working on the go-kart. So what's our takeaway from this episode? What did we learn? A few nights ago, I learned that my neighborhood and my memories came calling for me. They wouldn't let me sleep until we got together to have a talk, a reflection, and revisit one another again. As Kevin Arnold from the Wonder Years once said, I remember how hard it was growing up among people and places I loved. Most of all, I remember how hard it was to leave it all behind. For Life's Learning Curve, I'm Paul Hart. Subscribe to Life's Learning Curve at lifeslearningcurve.org and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Podchaser. Episode 44 of Life's Learning Curve podcast was put together by producer Paul Hart with assistance by Peter Bang and Sebastian T. Dog. We're mixed by Dennis Pittner, technical director Heidi Cerner. As always, music and audio assistance by Riley Hart. Visit our website, subscribe to our website, lifeslearningcurve.org. This episode has imaginative recreations. To protect the privacy of others, names and voices have been changed and characters conflated. As always, find our podcast almost all places podcasts are heard these days. Episode Invited Back Home. I'm Paul Hart, and we will be back soon with more Life's Learning Curve.
We're clear.